to the 2022 CADS Symposium. CADS, the Center for Applied Data Science, brings together a marriage of the theory of data science and the application, the widespread application of data science. And today's speaker will share with us some very moving information as to how data science can be applied to solving the problems of the world. Our speaker is Dr. Desmond Upton Patton. Professor Patton's research uses qualitative and computational data collection methods to examine the relationship between youth and gang violence and social media. How and why violence, grief, and identity are expressed on social media and real-world impact these expressions have on the well-being for low-income youth of color. He studies the ways in which gang-involved youth conceptualize threats on social media and the extent to which social media shapes and facilitates youth and gang violence. And we've all been touched by the violence that we've experienced right here in our area just yesterday. There were 3 to 4 shootings. And so anything that we can do to help relieve some of that violence is great. Dr. Patton is the founding director of SafeLab, a member of the Data Science Institute and a faculty affiliate of the Social Intervention Group. He holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Sociology. He is the recipient of the 2018 Deborah A. Pageant Early Career Achievement Award from the Society of Social Work Research and was named a 2017-18 fellow at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet Society. In partnership with the Data Science Institute, he is developing an online tool for detecting aggression in social media posts. Very, very valuable work. Dr. Patton's research on internet banging has been featured in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, USA Today, NPR, Boston Magazine, and many other public media distributors. It was cited in the amicus curiae brief submitted to the United States Supreme Court in Elonis versus United States, which examines the interpretation of threats on social media. He's a professor at Columbia University, and before joining Columbia, he was assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and School of Information. He holds the BA in Anthropology and Political Science with honors from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, our neighbor sister institution, and MSW from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and a PhD in Social Service Administration from the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming back to North Carolina and the Triad, Dr. Desmond Upton. Dr. Pat.
Good morning. And
good morning.
And thank you so much for that warm introduction. It is so wonderful to be back in the Triad, if only virtually. I'm honored to be with you all this morning. So I'm going to now attempt to share my slides seamlessly. We all know how cumbersome that can be, but I'm going to make the attempt right now. Okay. And then... One second. Try this one more time. Do it a different way. Okay, can we all see the slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so again, thank you so much for having me. Today, I want to focus on the broader impact social media has had on gun violence prevention and how I've been able to use artificial intelligence to do this work. For about a decade, I have understood and studied social media as a neighborhood, as an environmental context where youth spend an enormous amount of time building community, exchanging ideas, developing and running social media movements, and on the other end, engaged in and exposed to trauma, harm, grief, and violence expressed in text, video, images, live stream, and the like. Critical to this journey has been an intentional interdisciplinary approach and integration of ideas and theories and methods in order to define, analyze, and widely disseminate findings and challenges surrounding this new area of study of social media and gun violence. I define myself as a social worker, a social scientist, and a public interest technologist. I trained in anthropology as an undergraduate student just down the street at UNCG, studied social work as a master's student at Michigan, and then continued my training in social work, injury science, and sociology at the University of Chicago. My interest in technology and communications, however, was driven and motivated by my time with young Black boys and men in Chicago, who granted me the privilege to spend time to better understand how they navigate gun violence in their community. My work is powered by the SAFE Lab, for which I am the founding director. The lab is focused on examining the ways in which youth of color navigate violence in online and offline settings. We draw on computational social work approaches to researching communication theories, and we engage in qualitative natural language processing and computer vision methodologies to better understand the mechanisms of violence and how to prevent and intervene in violence that occurs in neighborhoods and in social media environments. So the problem of social media as a trigger or an amplifier of gun violence is not just a story about how users engage social media platforms. It must also contend with how platforms are designed, how artificial intelligence and other emerging tech tools are deployed to control what you see, and the community guidelines that are developed to mitigate harm for some. The problem of social media and gun violence is a transdisciplinary issue that requires an integration of not only methods and theories, but also a reimagining of who was at the table, what true community collaboration looks like, and a centering of marginalized voices, ideas, and beliefs that goes beyond checkboxes and window dressing. It also requires a 21st century research infrastructure that supports inclusive and equitable mass collaborations, transparency, and deep and critical reflection on potential harms and non-negotiables as a standard science practice. So I believe that social work should be at the forefront of technology design, in particular data science and AI design, development and deployment for real world applications. And so in my work over the last few years, I have been positing the idea of social work thinking as an apparatus of social change within the context of artificial intelligence design. So in my mind, social work thinking leverages the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics. Ideas like honoring the dignity and worth of human relationships and engaging in trustworthy practices that anchor how social work thinking can be applied for ethical AI design. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about my motivation for integrating this work around social media and violence. I'm going to give you more information on the importance of inclusion from community members. I'm going to share some recent and prior research studies that have been the foundation for the work that I'm doing today. I'm also going to talk about lessons learned because I've made some mistakes in this work that I think are critical. And I think it's important as researchers to be reflexive in our work. And then I'm going to talk about the future and hopefully impart some hope for the work ahead. So this work is motivated by two issues. One, gun violence is clearly an issue in the United States, and it's particularly acute in big cities. In particular, the city of Chicago, which I started my academic journey, my intellectual journey in this space, has experienced large swaths of increases in homicide over the last few years. And then at the same time, as violence continues to creep up and to experience lots of surges, young people are using social media at an enormous rate. And it is particularly prevalent among young Black youth. And so one of the important distinctions I think is that we need to make is that social media is no longer this virtual world that we can cast aside as this thing that people do. I think that we should now begin to understand social media as a part of the world. It is life, as what many young people from Chicago have told me. And so what we know is that youth have fully embraced social media, and often the family experts on how to use various platforms available to us. So how many of us may have asked a young person to help us get on a social media platform and to figure out what's happening on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook? Youth stated motivation for using social media is quite similar to traditional forms of communication: to stay in touch with friends, to make plans, to how to get to know people better, and to think about how to present oneself in different ways. Data from the Pew Institute suggests that 92% of youth of color are online daily. 71% use more than one social media site. And of those teens that are on social media, 45% are using Twitter. This is data that was the impetus for my work back in 2013. So the question that I have constantly been wrestling with in my mind is, what is the role of technology in violence transmission? So what we've seen over the last decade or so is a merger of complex beefs and taunts within and between crews and cliques that are expressed in short, pithy posts and images that oftentimes lack context, nuance, or any broader explanation. So what we see now is what Jeffrey Lane from Rutgers University calls the digital street, or what Robin Stevens from the University of Southern California calls the digital neighborhood. Now, the digital street is subtly different from the physical street in that it alters how people connect and restructures daily life by shaping identities, decisions, and behaviors of youth, and thus potentially impacting exposure to harm or increased risk for injury. So let's go back to 2012. I am a young assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and I come across a story about two well-known rappers, Chief Keef and Little JoJo. And Chief Keef and Little JoJo are both from the South Side of Chicago. They're from rival gangs, the Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples. And they're going back and forth on Twitter. And Little JoJo is fed up with the back and forth and posts on Twitter, if you want to meet me, want to do something about this, and meet me in this location. And so he posted on Twitter, and within 3 hours, he was murdered in the exact location that he posted. And so I became enthralled and confused with how this happened and why it happened and how it happened so quickly. And so I went to the literature to try to understand perhaps some of the motivation for why we got here in the first place. And there was essentially no literature about this phenomenon that I was observing and that had been talked about in local news reports. And so with colleagues from the University of Chicago, we drafted the first paper to coin the term internet banging, which essentially in this paper, this is a conceptual paper that interrogates the computer-mediated communications literature on gang violence, masculinity, and hip hop to try to draw some parameters around what we're observing. And so in this paper, we define internet banging, which is essentially a play on the word gang banging. Now, 10 years later, this is perhaps a term that I wouldn't use. In the paper, we focus primarily on individuals that may self-identify as being gang involved. as we've learned, behavior on social media is not a gang. It's not a gang-only behavior. We've seen radical and harmful and hateful speech from everyone, from every race, no matter what class or positionality you have. And so this concept of harmful behavior for me has been evolving as we dive deeper into data. My beginning in this work was to connect with Eddie Bocanegra. Eddie, who you see who has his foot on the chair, has a storied history. He was a gang member in Chicago and spent 14 years in prison. He got out of prison, went straight to college, and got a master's in social work from the University of Chicago, and has dedicated his life to community violence prevention. He is now extremely well-known violence expert with the Department of Justice in DC. But Eddie, before Eddie and I crafted an internet banging study, and before we began this study, he forced me to answer questions about my approach. Before he was going to connect me with any young people, he wanted to make sure that I would not be doing harm to those young people, that I would have their best interest, that this work would be mutually beneficial. And so I remember sitting in a car lot in Chicago for 2 hours, explaining myself and trying to unpack why I'm doing this work before I gain entry into the community. And I share that example because, you know, doing this work requires lots of flexibility and reflexive attitudes to really make sure that the work that we're doing is not going to cause harm and that it's truly in line with the wants and needs of community members. And so Andy and I received funding from the University of Michigan to start the Internet Banging Study, which is a qualitative study that was in collaboration with the YMCA, for which Eddie was the then executive director. We engaged in inductive qualitative analysis and semi-structured interviews and interview a number of Black boys and men, and also outreach workers. And these are all individuals that we were able to connect with through the YMCA and through Eddie's connection. And our central question at the time, this is what kicks off all of the work ahead, is what's the role of social media in gang violence? From that study, we learned a lot. And in particular, we learned a lot from outreach workers about what they understand and know about social media and gang violence. And there were a number of things that came out. Number one is that they understood that social media is where we have to be. In order to do violence work, in order to do mental health work, in order to do community-based work, you have to be integrated and understand the role of social media. You also have to understand that language is subjective and that our interpretation of what's being said on social media, how we process that information, and how it might be used for data collection in the future requires a multidisciplinary approach. And also requires understanding that you might not be the expert and that you may misinterpret, and that misinterpretation can be as violent as the violence that happens in the physical world. And so these revelations became true and clear for us as we conducted interviews with outreach workers and young boys and men in Chicago. Here's an example of what we heard from one of our participants. And they said, they'll put it on Facebook. I'll meet you at. Everybody knows that when they're going to fight, they're going to go to the fight at Farragut, which is a high school in Chicago. But they won't say Farragut because the fight will get there faster than you think. When kids put it on there, I go there. I walk there. When I get there, the crowd is really frustrated, waiting on the ones they're going to beat up. When the girls come, it's jabber, jabber. I let them talk. Then I'll jump in there. You're going to fight over a guy? Really? A guy that you don't even know, you don't even have? I make up some jokes there and I'll make them laugh. Then they don't ever fight. So when somebody dies, it has happened since leadership found out, but when guys die, they would make up a Facebook page, such as such and such Rott's page, instead of being like Jose Garcia's page, for instance. Speedy Rots, and then it would be pictures of him, and then you know they would draw disrespectful symbols like penises in his mouth and bloodstains all over, and it would fuel more stuff. So here we see the transition from an argument that would happen in real time in the physical world, and how if something happens, if someone is harmed or someone passes away, how that experience that is posted on social media can quickly turn into another physical or violent altercation. So the work, the individual that has changed my life, that has changed how I think about this work, is this young girl, Jakira Barnes. Jakira was exposed to violence at a very young age and had recurring experiences with death and loss. This young girl probably experienced more death in her short life than most of us would experience in a full life. Just weeks after her first birthday, her father was shot and killed. She entered her formative years and she joined a gang in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago, which is just south of the University of Chicago, where I was studying. The death that seemed to impact Jakira the most was that of her friend Taekwon Tyler, a 13-year-old boy who was murdered in their neighborhood. She then adopted the Twitter handle @Taekwon Assassin in reference to him. Before Jakira's own brutal and untimely death on April 11, 2014, her friend Little B was shot and killed by the Chicago police on March 29th. And so in our work, I wanted to understand how people responded to Jakira's death, and if there would be any retaliation based on the post that Jakira and individuals in her network would post. So you might imagine Jakira as being my patient zero for the work ahead. And so, as I said, I went into the work, and one of the critical issues, one of the biggest mistakes that I made in this work is that I have been reading and imbibing news articles about young Black girls, about Jakira, and the toxic nature of those articles informed how I looked at Jakira. And so instead of seeing a young Black girl with a complex life as someone that loved and cared for others, I imbibed an immense amount of white toxic language and understanding of young Black girls, and that informed how I looked at social media data. And so when I looked at social media data, I saw violence. I saw violent anger bad. And that's what I found. I found posts like, Vernon, that's the deadline. You cross the up on the headlines. Anyone can get these hands in this life. We see the ops, you're gonna smoke them. But what Jakira forced me to do in her death was to reckon with her humanity in ways that I had not done before. And it was a humbling moment as a Black man studying Black young people to realize that I too carry attitudes and beliefs that can be harmful for my community. And so the work has forced me to engage in reflexive practices to make sure that I'm unearthing biases that may exist. And so Jakira showed herself in her work. She showed me grief and pain and trauma and love. On 4am, the ops killed my bro, broken heart. My struggle ain't ever been told. Posts like this have kept me up at night. They forced me to rethink how I do this work and why I'm doing this work. It also forced me to think about my understanding of language and context and culture on social media. And am I missing something? Am I the expert here? I think sometimes the PhD can fool you into thinking that you know a lot, but who might be the better expert? What tools might we need? What methodologies might we need in order to do this work well? And so one of the things that came out of this revelation was the development of the contextual analysis of social media methodology. This is a methodology that was co-created with young people and social workers and data scientists to center the experiences and language of Black and Brown youth, and to make sure that we are honoring their experiences in true ways. And so through Chasm, what we call it, we provide a methodological process to contextually driven and domain-specific decisions to label social media data for the training of algorithmic systems. The Chasm approach serves as a method to bridge the identified gap between inadequacies in current language processing tools and differences in geographic, cultural, and age-related variants of social media use and communication. Now, Chasm focuses on utilizing a team community-based approach to annotating and qualitatively analyzing social media data, explicitly grounded by deep community expertise and understanding. And so here, one of the things that we bring as social workers and social scientists is a deeper focus on annotation, in that your algorithmic systems are only going to be as good as your annotation. And how might we disrupt annotation processes in a way that make them more robust, that bring deeper meaning, complex meaning, and greater nuance into the work? One of the ways in which we do that is that we honor expertise. And so here we hired young Black and Brown boys and girls, men and women, to be research assistants in the lab. And so we hired these young people from Chicago, and we paid them the same way in which we would pay a graduate research assistant. And we said, you are the experts on language. You are the experts on community. We need your help in order to translate and interpret the work. The words that we're seeing online, the pictures that we're seeing, help us understand backstories and deeper meaning, but also check us, right? Should we be doing this work? Is this actually going to be helpful for violence prevention? Is there anything that we don't know that we should know? These are the types of questions. Now, bringing in young people has been extremely helpful, but it is also not an easy process. And so we had to partner with the YMCA and identify mentors to help support the workflow between my lab and the young people, because these young people were living lives and had complex lives. And so things would come up in their life and they wouldn't be able to support the work. And so we had to figure out mechanisms to keep the work moving, but to also have a safety net so that young people can be successful in the work that they're doing as well. So these young people here have been instrumental. We could not have done any of the work that we've done over the last few years without their input. And instead of calling them research assistants, we call them domain experts, to honor the expertise that they bring to the lab and to data science work more broadly. So let me walk you through how we apply Chasm. We also created an annotation system that mimics a social media-like atmosphere. And we asked annotators, these are the domain experts, and also social work students who are training for the MSW, to look closely and to label social media data. And so we created a process for how they might do that. So one of the things that we did is we collected large amounts of data connected to Shakira Barnes and individuals in her network, and we plugged it into our new annotation system and asked our annotators to review and to give us insights. Before we did that, we wanted to make sure that we were getting lots of context. And so Chasm forces the annotators to consider several steps of context, eliciting context, the author, what's happening in this post, the virality of a post, to make sure that we are grappling with as close to accurate meaning as possible. So here's an example of something that that an annotator would do. So the post is, I've been up for like 3 days straight. We asked the annotator to provide their first understanding of what's happening in that post without any context. And so the annotator says, well, he hasn't slept in days. As you might imagine, that's not helpful information, doesn't give you lots of context, isn't particularly useful. Well, then we asked them to go through our Chasm process, go back to the social media posts, utilize web-based resources like Hip Hop Wiki, go back to the author, look at the peer network, because someone may claim to be gang involved but be following Disney characters. So making sure to understand, to unearth any discontinuity there. Looking at offline events and how offline events shape language and behavior online, the virality of a post, and the engagement with other users around that post. So the annotator goes back, does all of that, comes back to the post, and now has more to say. Now the annotator says, this user is saying that he's been up for 3 days straight, most likely meaning he hasn't slept. This post comes days after his friend was killed. This user may be having difficulty sleeping because of his friend's death. So now we understand that grief is at play here, and that this grief may encounter, this user may encounter grief, and this experience with grief is also influencing and informing how they behave on social media. They also indicate the types of emojis that accompany this post as well. We then asked the annotator to label the social media posts. And so one of the most complicated things for me as a social work scientist is to engage in these binary classifications of data, to put things in these neat little boxes. And as social scientists and mental health practitioners, we know that behavior is complex, right? And so we attempted to be able to lump these very concrete behaviors together. The most predominant behaviors that we saw were grief and aggression. And then here you see lots of other behaviors like social behavior, mood, status seeking, health that were classified as other, but our predominant labels for our algorithmic systems were loss and aggression. But before we provide a final label, before you get that final code, we then go back to the domain experts. We want to validate how our MSW students have been annotating the data. We want to also study disagreement to understand, well, what might be the difference between how our domain experts and our social work students are viewing the data, and let's study that as well. We then tested Chasm using machine learning processes to identify, does it really help to have deeper context? And what we learned is that absolutely yes. And so on the test set, the model trained on hand labeled data, annotated labels, received a accuracy score of 64%, which means that we were getting the correct labels right 64% of the time, versus using a distant learning model or traditional natural language processing model, which only had an accuracy measure of around 52%. Now, these numbers are all relatively low, but here the distinction is that having qualitative insights, having social work insights, having community level insights does help us in getting as close to an accurate meaning in a way that is helpful for algorithmic systems being able to detect those things automatically. And so that data set, that annotated data set, is then handed off to our colleagues at Columbia in the computer science department. My colleagues here are Kathy McEwen, who is an expert in text summarization, and Dr. Shifu Cheng, who is now the Dean of the School of Engineering at Columbia, who is an expert at computer vision. And so together over the last few years, we've engaged in a set of experiments to test whether or not we can automatically detect psychosocial codes of aggression, grief, and substance use in Twitter data. So our objective is to predict aggression, loss, and other unseen tweets. We start small, and then we explore a larger unlabeled data set, and we use context from the tweet, semantic context, emotional context, and the user interactions. In our first study together, we start off very small. We only use a very small training data set, and because we wanted to see to what extent gold standard NLP tools work. And what we learned is that none of the gold standard NLP tools worked on this domain because it had not been able to grapple with African-American vernacular English. It had no ability to grapple with context or nuance. And one of the most difficult and complicated conversations that I had to have with my data science colleagues was over the use of the N-word, in which the NLP tools consistently and constantly label the N-word as being an aggressive term. And then we had to have a conversation around the diversity of the N term and how it may not be, how it should not be included as an aggressive term in our work together. We published this work in one of the NLP conferences. And one of the things that we learned from this work is that transdisciplinary work in this space is needed to grapple with context, that AI tools can be helpful, but they cannot be tools that are used in silos, that qualitative work and diverse thinking in this space is critical for making sure that the NLP tools are not misfiring in this space in a way that can lead to more surveillance of Black and Brown young people. So then we decided to add more data. So now we increase our labeled tweets to almost 5,000 tweets. And these tweets come from Jakira Barnes and her top communicators. And our tweets were labeled by community domain experts and MSW students. We then also get more unlabeled tweets. So now we have up to 1 million tweets, and we identify those tweets by finding 279 users through a snowball sampling technique. And again, by focusing on the 14 top communicators as seed users from Jakira. These are individuals that she had the most mentions and replies with as well. So in this second experiment, our data set is 6 times larger than prior work. We're using specific resources that are induced from the unlabeled data set and really focus on context features that capture semantic and emotional content in users' recent posts and their interactions with other users. Now, when we use more context, have more data, and also employ deep learning techniques, our F measure has increased. And so in that first study, our F measure was around 62%. When we use more context, when we have more data, our F measure is closer to 70%. And so our approach shows that integrating emotions and semantic content of a user's recent posts is an important component for the task of predicting aggression and loss in social media posts of gang-involved youth. Furthermore, using domain-specific embeddings and aggression loss lexicon induced from a corpus of language constructed to represent our specific community of users is also critical to success as well. And then we also wanted to see to what extent leveraging data from images can be useful in our ability to identify these psychosocial codes. And so we gathered almost 2,000 tweets that had an accompanying visual concept as well. And so we compare various methods for classifying tweets into 3 classes. One that uses text of the tweet, only the image of the tweet, or both modalities and input into the classifier. And so we then run experiments to see which one works for identifying grief or aggression or substance use. Here's an example of the types of images that we had in our data set. These are not from our data set. These are from a stockpile from Google, but here's an example of the types of data that we saw. What we learned is that NLP tools were much better at grief because grief is more expressive online. Computer vision-based tools are much better at aggression because it was able to identify things like guns. And then both text and computer vision were equally as good at identifying substance use like joints and lean, which is promethazine, and some type of juice as well. So you all might be wondering, man, this sounds really scary. This sounds like Big Brother. You're looking at lots of data. Is this helpful? Is this harmful? And I think all of the above is true, right? Because this work comes with real work ethical dilemmas. What I've learned is that this work sits between 2 critical issues. You know, there are Black families who want their children to be safe and desire any tool possible that is going to achieve those ends. And so there is a privilege to be able to say, can we pick a tool that's going to keep my child safe? Most parents don't care and want their kids to be safe at all costs. As a social worker and social scientist, I also know that digital surveillance and policing enhance another form of violence, state violence on Black and Brown communities as well. And so using these tools to peer into the lives of Black and Brown communities are also used in digital policing to arrest people, uses negative character testimony. So it can be equally as problematic, creating a new apparatus for mass incarceration or e-carceration. So what I think is that, you know, using Chasm, using NLP, using computer vision tools should be accompanied by a robust set of ethical guidelines that you should consider. You should think about the consequences of applying these tools. Do you actually want an accurate NLP tool that looks at Black speech? Is that helpful for Black people or is it harmful? The measurement for successful NLP tools is something that we need to think about. Is accuracy the best measure when applied to this particular use case? Are there other measures that we need to consider? And then extraction of context for NLP systems, how it's derived and analyzed and validated should always be on the chopping block. We should always be deeply analyzing, reflecting on these processes as we move forward. My goal has always been to be able to support social workers and outreach workers that are doing this work, to be able to give them data points so that when they're trying to intervene in violence, they also have a data point from social media to help them make the most robust intervention plan possible. But again, this ethical piece keeps me up at night. It keeps me up at night because of racism. So here we have young Black men who are just north of Columbia University who were followed and surveilled on Facebook for years based on their Facebook pictures and associations, who were arrested based on the largest gang bust in New York City because they were connected to people that were thought to be gang involved. And so they were arrested on a conspiracy charge. Some of them had no connection to gangs at all, but their Facebook associations suggested that they were connected. They were living in the same apartment complex as other individuals, versus these two white men who committed mass murders, but left racist manifestos on social media platforms that were only reviewed and looked at post hoc. They committed the murders, and then we decided to look at their social media account versus the preemptive surveillance that happened to young Black men. And so again, this work has to be done in community. It has to be done with this idea that there are lots of issues that can come about in applying social media for surveillance and for digital policing. So here are a couple of things that I think we should take home with. I think that social media is a community where young people live, and it's not necessarily distinct from their offline world. It's a powerful tool for understanding root causes of violence. I think that AI offers opportunities to augment and bolster current violence prevention efforts. However, social media and AI are not the sole answers to violence prevention. When not used thoughtfully and correctly, social media and AI can be tools for surveillance and mass incarceration. I'm gonna say that one more time. When not used thoughtfully and correctly, social media and AI can be used for tools for surveillance and mass incarceration. I think that context is extremely important when interpreting social media, but it's important that you have a process for uncovering and recognizing your personal and institutional bias, no matter who you are or where you come from. And you might consider, when using social media, you should ask yourself, is this the right thing for the job? And again, this work should not be done alone. If you're a computer scientist, go across the aisle, go across the corridor, meet social workers, meet clinical psychologists, meet anthropologists, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. For those who want to continue to understand this work, I have a book coming out called Finding Jakira, where I talk about the lessons that I've learned from Jakira and the mistakes that I've made. This work will be published at the University of California Press. This work has informed a set of tech programs that I'm now running. I have an AI for All summer program where young people, young Black and brown folks from all over the country come spend 3 weeks at Columbia learning artificial intelligence and social work. I want to use a research lab for former incarcerated citizens to get involved in technology, and also want to use technology lab out of Brownsville, Brooklyn as well. This work has informed this need for pathways for young people of color to get involved in technology. We'd love to be able to send folks who do our program to Winston-Salem to then learn and study applied data science as well. The work that we're up to now, we have understood that grief is a critical step in how aggressive communication forms on social media. So we're focused on the articulation of grief online. And so we're doing lots of studies to understand the grief process online and how grief shapes more aggressive comments over time as well. We also created a data science minor in social work. It's one of the first data science minors in a school of social work. Again, understanding the need for technology tools and to understand social media as an environment that we're based in, that we live in, that shapes community, that shapes individuals, and that shapes the future of our society. But where I'm going is this vision: how do we get from trauma and move towards joy? And so the work that I'm now invested in now is, how do we engage in digital restorative justice and healing through citizen science, right? So how do we move users from trauma to joy? And how do we use data science methods to study this as well? The way forward includes education, that we need to train community members to understand the importance of data science as well, and to create an inclusive workforce. We need a praxis for designing approaches that are that are about healing and that reduce gun violence, and that this work has to have policy implications, right? So how do we leverage things like social work thinking as an approach for ethical development of data science tools? It's been wonderful to spend time with you all. Please reach out. You have my email, you have the Safe Lab site, and you can connect with me on Twitter as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patton. This was such a moving presentation, and it's especially moving to me because I served on the Juvenile Justice Council in Winston-Salem for 15 years. And had we had the insight at that time to use tools such as this, I'm sure we would have been more aggressive in solving some of the problems about youth. At this time, we're going to open the floor for questions. You may use the chat, or you may indicate that you want to speak, and we will recognize you so that you can ask questions. Dr. Deb, would you monitor the chat and recognize people with questions?
Yes, Dr. Jones, I'll be happy to keep track of the chat as well. So there are a lot of thank yous and amazing presentation notes from the chat.
Yes.
Dr. Smith has a question.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate that, Dr. Patton. Really appreciate it. Russ Smith, geography here, GIS. I'm curious, have you incorporated, thought about, I know a lot of communities are moving to the triangulation method of where gunshots are found to collect data points. So they're collecting, the noise and triangulating the location of where the gunshot happened. And I'm aware of this a little bit, not more than basically that. So I don't know how real time it is. And I know it's not really social media, but it is another point of potential data that can be incorporated or thought about in terms of just, lowering violence in communities.
No, so thank you for the question. No, we have not engaged in that particular data source. I think that's really exciting though, because one of the things that happens on social media is that there is lots of talk about where things are happening, right? And so if there's a way to triangulate, mentions of institutions, addresses, intersections with some connection with noise in our images, then that could be potentially useful. And going back to my point at the end, that would also require community involvement to make sure that that particular strategy is not overused. And so the challenge that we keep getting into is like, when is it, like, how much is enough, and when have we crossed the line? I think as a preventative measure, it sounds great, but then as a policing tool, it could be overused as well. So figuring out what that balance is, I think would be great, but I will definitely look more into this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Dr. Keith?
Okay. Good morning. That was an excellent presentation. I like your work a lot. And I wanted to know if you are working with community-based organizations who are boots on the ground with youth development, and wanted to know how you're working with them or how you envision working with them. So I'm putting more on the plate, right?
No, this is exactly what I want to do. And so I've spent a lot of time working with Cure Violence and other violence prevention organizations in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in New York City, in Chicago. The hardest thing has been to get this work funded in a way that's actually useful for those organizations, right? And so because there's so many ethical challenges, when we try to get funding to do the direct gun violence related work, it doesn't get funded. Our new method has been to focus on grief. And so we were able to get NSF funding to be able to focus on that. And that will allow us to re-engage our community partners in that space as well.
Okay. So have you tried HUD?
We have not tried HUD, no.
Oh, okay. I think they would be very interested because they want to decrease the violence of, their areas.
Thank you so much.
And just send me an email. I'll get you the connection.
I will. Thank you so much.
Chancellor Robinson.
Yes, Dr. Patton. Just a question in terms of this work, which appears to be so heavily trauma related. I'm wondering how you deal with that as both as a researcher and a research team, as well as students who are involved in this work. How do you handle that whole issue and that whole space of trauma?
That's such a good question. And I think luckily we are able to double down on our social work processes to first understand and to acknowledge the trauma that we may experience vicariously through looking at so much on social media. And so we have a set of processes that allow people to step away. We have processes in our report out meetings to help people process the trauma that they're seeing. Folks can take time away from the work at any point. So this isn't, content moderation at Facebook where you're looking at thousands of posts all day long. No, you can take as many breaks as possible. But it's also become a learning mechanism because I think a lot of our annotators are observing things that they don't have to encounter in their daily life, and it's helping them to understand the privileges that they have in their life. And so it also has operated as a learning tool for them in terms of their social work training that I didn't plan for or prepare for as well. But we do a lot of processing to make sure that people are okay.
We do have a question/comment in the chat. It says, fantastic presentation. I am wondering if you are considering using large language models such as GPT-3, which have been trained on internet scale data. Such large language models may be better at understanding, analyzing, and predicting from the unique language of these communities.
So yes, but oftentimes those language models are not inclusive of the diversity of Black speech. And so we are now in the situation now with the NSF study where we're trying to identify large scale data models, but they have not been, they're not inclusive of the communities that we're working with. And we have to do a lot of processing of that data to make sure that we are getting as close to accurate meaning as possible. And so I would love for there to be a large data model that represented the Black community, but, and there are some, but it is a tremendous amount of work. And so I think we're getting closer. We have some data sets, but the pre-processing of that data is so laborious in this space.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. I see a hand raised in the group here. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yes.
Awesome. Wonderful presentation, Dr. Patton. My name
you.
is Erica Fosu with Vanguard. I'm a diversity recruiting specialist here and an avid TikTok watcher. I love TikTok. And what I often see, because I'm on the Black side of TikTok, is that there are disproportional discriminations in regards to how the algorithm in TikTok is made, that it will remove Black content creators' content before they remove non-Black content creators. And then also they will also deem a lot of content that Black people are speaking about regarding racism, hate, all of that as hate speech, when in actuality it's not. They're just expressing their experiences as a Black person in America. So I guess my question to you is, what do you foresee, or if at all, that collaboration between large corporations, between like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, for your organization to help inform them on how their algorithms may be hurting our community and hurting the voices of Black and Brown users of those platforms? And what, like, do you is that something that you think your organization will kind of venture into in collaboration with these large platforms? Or otherwise, how else do you hope to help inform these organizations of their incorrect practices, if any?
Thank you for the question. And I'm also a big TikTok fan as well. This is exactly why we need CAD. This is precisely why we need CAD needs multi-million dollars to train Black and brown folks to get involved in technology, and not just from a data science perspective, from an applied data science perspective, where they're integrating data science techniques with psychology and sociology and anthropology and geography. Because the issue is that we don't have enough folks with that nuanced insight at the table. This is, I think, a critical issue. It starts with people. It's not the algorithm's fault. It starts with who was at the table, how they got to the table. And this is exactly why we need to fully fund centers like CAD and need more centers like CAD and need collaborations with CAD in order to do this kind of work more efficiently. So I think you understand the problem. And I think the problem is a human resource problem as well.
For sure. Thank you.
There is one more question in the chat. So yeah, regarding the question above, how different would the contextual analysis of social media from the city of Chicago differ from that of NYC?
Great question. So the promise of Chasm is that it is context, like it doesn't matter where you're coming from, right? And so it's really based on you being able to identify the domain experts for that particular community to be a part of the annotation process, right? And so you could have a language model or language data sets from any part of the world, and then you would need to think about the annotation piece and who should be involved in that process. And so you would need those insights from folks in New York City in order to make sure that you're grappling with language in the most appropriate ways.
Thank you, Dr. Patton. I see another question. I would ask Dr. Taylor probably or you can reply in the chat as well, Dr. Patton, because we need to move on with our schedule. Thank you once again for such an inspiring presentation. This is exactly what we are trying to accomplish at CATS, inspire more faculty and students to be involved in real life problems where the computer vision, NLP, and machine learning could be applied to give us some more insight. So thank you, great presentation.
Thank you for having me. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you.